Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Dinner That Changed Everything. Gerald Orozco sat at the head of his mahogany dining table, the same spot he'd occupied for 15 years of marriage. The crystal chandelier cast warm light over the remnants of another silent dinner, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the contempt in his wife's eyes had finally crystallized into words. "You are a nobody. Don't pretend you matter." Lynette Orozco's voice cut through the air like a blade. Her auburn hair caught the light as she shook her head in disgust. "Honestly, we forget you exist half the time." Their 18-year-old daughter, Emily, looked up from her phone, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with casual cruelty. "She's right, Dad. You're just there, like furniture." Gerald's weathered hands, scarred from his years as a Marine before transitioning to private security consulting, remained steady as he reached for his wine glass. At 45, he'd built a successful business protecting corporate executives and high-net-worth individuals. His analytical mind, honed by military strategy and psychological profiling, had made him wealthy enough to afford this sprawling suburban mansion. Yet somehow, he'd become invisible in his own home. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man whose job was to anticipate threats, to read people's intentions, to protect others from betrayal, and he'd been blind to what was happening under his own roof. He clinked his fork against his wine glass, the crystal singing a pure, clear note. Both women looked at him with surprise. Gerald never interrupted their conversations, never demanded attention. "This won't take long," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Just 3 sentences." By the second sentence, Lynette's face had gone pale. By the third, Emily had set down her phone entirely. "I know about Marco Houston," Gerald continued, watching his wife's manicured fingers tremble against her wine glass. "I know about the Tuesday afternoons at the Riverside Hotel, and I know that you both think I'm too pathetic to do anything about it." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Lynette's mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. Emily's eyes darted between her parents, finally understanding that the family dynamic she'd taken for granted was about to shift dramatically. Gerald stood, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the table. "Finish your dinner. We'll talk more tomorrow." As he walked toward his study, Gerald could hear Lynette's whispered frantically to Emily. They were planning, scheming, trying to figure out how much he knew and how to minimize the damage. They still thought they were dealing with the same passive man who'd endured their disrespect for years. They had no idea who Gerald Orozco really was. In his study, Gerald opened his laptop and pulled up files he'd hoped never to use. His military training had taught him that knowledge was power, and his security business had given him access to resources most people couldn't imagine. For weeks, he'd been gathering intelligence, not because he'd suspected the affair, but because his professional instincts had finally kicked in. The evidence was damning. Photos, credit card records, phone logs, even audio recordings from the surveillance equipment he'd discreetly placed throughout their home. But evidence was just the beginning. What Gerald was planning would require much more than proof of infidelity. Marco Houston, 38, was a successful real estate developer with a reputation for ruthless business practices and a taste for married women. He'd built his fortune by acquiring distressed properties and forcing out longtime residents, gentrifying neighborhoods without regard for the communities he destroyed. His personal life was equally predatory. Lynette was his 4th married conquest in as many years. But Marco had made a crucial mistake. He targeted the wrong man's wife. Gerald pulled up Marco's financial records, business partnerships, and personal connections. His security firm had contracts with 3 of the banks that held Marco's construction loans. His former military colleagues now worked in various government agencies. His client list included judges, prosecutors, and police commissioners. Marco Houston had no idea he was about to go to war with someone who had spent 20 years learning how to destroy enemies without leaving fingerprints. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Destruction. 3 days after the dinner revelation, Gerald sat in his downtown office overlooking the city's financial district. His security consulting firm, Orozco Strategic Solutions, occupied the entire 23rd floor of the Meridian Tower. The irony that Marco Houston's development company had built this very building wasn't lost on him. His assistant, Angela Ingram, knocked on his door. At 52, Angela had worked with Gerald since he'd started the company 8 years ago. She was former FBI, brilliant, and absolutely loyal. More importantly, she shared Gerald's belief that betrayal should never go unpunished. "The background checks you requested are complete," she said, setting a thick folder on his desk. "Marco Houston is even worse than we thought." Gerald opened the file. Inside were detailed reports on Marco's business practices, his relationships, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. The man was leveraged to the hilt, having borrowed heavily for his latest development project, a luxury condominium complex that was already behind schedule and over budget. "What about my wife's activities?" Gerald asked. Angela's expression hardened. "Lynette has been quite busy. The affair with Marco started 6 months ago, but there's more. She's been systematically moving money from your joint accounts into a private account. Small amounts, but it adds up to nearly $80,000. Gerald nodded. He'd expected as much. Lynette had always been calculating, but desperation made people sloppy. "And Emily, your daughter has been keeping some interesting company. Wendell Frederick, Marco's business partner, has been taking her to expensive restaurants and buying her gifts. She thinks it's because she's special, but Marco is using her to get closer to our family," Gerald finished. "Or possibly to gather information about my business." The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. Not only had his wife been cheating, but his daughter had been manipulated into becoming an unwitting spy. The rage that had been building inside Gerald crystallized into something cold and sharp. "I want you to initiate Operation Demolition," Gerald said, using the code name they developed for their most comprehensive investigative protocols. Full-spectrum intelligence gathering on both targets. Financial records, personal communications, business dealings, everything. Angela smiled grimly. "It'll be my pleasure. What about the family situation?" "I'll handle that personally. Lynette and Emily still think they're dealing with the same man who's been rolling over for years. They're about to learn otherwise." That evening, Gerald returned home to find Lynette waiting in the living room, dressed in the black cocktail dress he'd bought her for their anniversary. Her strategy was obvious: seduce him into forgiveness and compliance. She'd used the same approach whenever she'd been caught in smaller lies over the years. "Gerald, darling," she began, her voice honey-sweet. "I think we need to talk about what you said the other night." "You're right," Gerald replied, settling into his leather armchair. "We do need to talk. First, about the $80,000 you've stolen from our accounts." Lynette's carefully composed expression flickered. "I don't know what you—" "Second," Gerald continued, "about Emily's relationship with Wendell Frederick. Did you know he's been reporting back to Marco about our conversations? About my work schedule? About when I'm traveling?" The color drained from Lynette's face. "You're being paranoid. Emily is just—" "Third," Gerald's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than shouting. "About the fact that you and your daughter have been treating me like a fool for months, possibly years, while planning to take half my assets in what you assumed would be an easy divorce." Lynette stood abruptly, her mask finally slipping. "You can't prove any of that. And even if you could, what are you going to do about it? You're not exactly the confrontational type, Gerald." Gerald smiled, and something in his expression made Lynette take a step backward. "You're absolutely right. I'm not confrontational. I'm something much worse. I'm patient. I'm thorough. And I never, ever forgive." As Lynette fled upstairs, Gerald poured himself a scotch and began making phone calls. By morning, the first phase of his plan would be in motion. Marco Houston's construction loans were about to be called in for routine audit. The City Planning Commission was going to discover some irregularities in the permits for his luxury condo project. And the IRS was about to receive an anonymous tip about some very interesting offshore accounts. But that was just the beginning. Gerald wasn't just planning to destroy Marco's business. He was going to dismantle his entire life, piece by piece, until the man understood exactly what it meant to cross the wrong person. Chapter 3. The Web Titans. 2 weeks later, Marco Houston sat in his glass-walled office, staring at a stack of legal documents that had arrived that morning. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call his lawyer. "Jimmy, it's Marco. Tell me you have good news about these audit notices." Jimmy Perkins, Marco's attorney for the past 5 years, sounded exhausted. "I wish I did. The bank consortium is demanding full financial disclosure on all your current projects. The city has red-tagged your Riverside development pending a complete permit review, and the EPA wants to inspect your Northside property for potential environmental violations." "That's impossible," Marco said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Everything was cleared through proper channels." "Marco, when was the last time you checked your offshore accounts?" The question hit Marco like a physical blow. "What do you mean? The Cayman account? It's been frozen pending an IRS investigation. Someone provided them with detailed records of every transaction for the past 3 years." Marco's phone slipped from his hand. The offshore account contained nearly $2 million, money he'd need to cover his construction loans if the bank called him in. Without it, his entire business empire would collapse like a house of cards. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Houston, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." Marco had forgotten about the meeting. He'd scheduled it weeks ago with a potential investor who'd expressed interest in his luxury development project. Right now, he needed every cent he could raise. The investor turned out to be a distinguished man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed and carrying himself with quiet confidence. He introduced himself as Gerald Orozco, president of Orozco Strategic Solutions. "I understand you're looking for additional financing for your Riverside project," Gerald said, settling into the chair across from Marco's desk. Marco studied his visitor carefully. Something about the name was familiar, but he couldn't place it. "That's right. Though I should mention we've hit a few minor snags with permits. Nothing that can't be resolved, I'm sure," Gerald replied smoothly. "I've done my research on your company. Very impressive track record." For the next hour, Gerald asked detailed questions about Marco's business, his development timeline, and his financial projections. To Marco, it seemed like a standard investor meeting, but Gerald was actually cataloging every vulnerability, every pressure point he could exploit. "I'm prepared to offer you a bridge loan of $5 million, Gerald finally said. Marco's eyes widened. It was exactly the amount he needed to weather the current crisis. That's very generous. What are your terms?" "Standard rates, but I do require comprehensive collateral. Your Riverside property, your Northside holdings, and your personal guarantee backed by your primary residence." It was aggressive, but Marco was desperate. "I'll need to review this with my attorney." "Of course. Take your time." Gerald stood and shook Marco's hand. "Oh, one more thing. I'll need character references. Professional and personal. I can provide business references easily enough. I was thinking more along the lines of personal relationships. People who can vouch for your integrity. Your girlfriend, perhaps." Marco's blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry, Lynette Orozco. She is your girlfriend, isn't she?" The silence in the room was deafening. Marco's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, pure terror. "You're Lynette's husband." "Yes." Gerald's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "And Emily's father. You remember Emily, don't you? Sweet girl. My daughter." Marco's hands were visibly shaking now. "Look, Mr. Orozco, I can explain." "No need. I understand completely. You saw an opportunity, and you took it. A bored housewife, a successful businessman who might have useful connections, a teenage daughter who could provide inside information. It's actually quite clever." Gerald walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. "The problem is, you made one critical error in your planning." "What's that?" Gerald turned back to Marco, and his smile was the most terrifying thing Marco had ever seen. "You assumed I was weak." Marco reached for his phone, but Gerald raised a hand. "Before you call security, you should know that I own the company that provides security for this building. I also hold the primary note on the building itself through one of my investment partnerships. And as of this morning, I own 60% of your construction loans." The reality of his situation crashed down on Marco like an avalanche. "What do you want?" "Justice," Gerald replied simply. You destroyed my family. Now I'm going to destroy everything you've ever built. Your business, your reputation, your relationships, your future. All of it. You can't do this. It's illegal. Gerald laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Everything I'm doing is perfectly legal. I'm simply a concerned investor protecting my interests. The fact that you'll be ruined in the process is just serendipity. As Gerald walked toward the door, Marco called after him desperately. What about Lynette? What about Emily? Gerald paused without turning around. What about them? They made their choices. They chose to betray me, to humiliate me, to treat me like I was nothing. Now, they get to live with the consequences. But they're your No, Gerald said quietly. Family doesn't betray family. Family doesn't steal from family. Family doesn't bring strangers into your home to destroy you from the inside. He finally turned back to Marco. They stopped being my family the moment they chose you over me. After Gerald left, Marco sat alone in his office as the weight of his situation settled over him. He was trapped in a web he hadn't even seen being woven around him. Every avenue of escape had been quietly closed off by a man he dismissed as a passive victim. For the first time in his adult life, Marco Houston understood what it meant to be hunted by someone more intelligent, more ruthless, and far more patient than himself. Chapter 4. The First Domino Falls. Within 48 hours of Gerald's visit to Marco's office, the real estate developer's world began to collapse in earnest. Gerald sat in his study at home, monitoring the destruction from multiple computer screens that tracked financial markets, legal filings, and news reports in real time. The first domino fell when Meridian Bank, the primary lender for Marco's Riverside project, officially called in his construction loan. The bank's decision was influenced by a routine audit that had mysteriously uncovered irregularities in the project's environmental impact assessments, irregularities that Gerald had carefully planted through his connections in the city planning office. Gerald's phone rang. It was Angela Ingram. Phase 1 is complete, she reported. Marco's scrambling to find alternative financing, but every major lender in the region has been quietly advised about his risk profile. His credit rating just dropped 60 points. What about his personal situation? Even better, Wendell Frederick, his business partner, has been asking uncomfortable questions about the company's financial stability. Our sources indicate they had a rather heated argument yesterday. Gerald smiled grimly. Wendell Frederick was the key to the second phase of his plan. Through Emily, Gerald had learned that Wendell was the ambitious junior partner who'd always resented Marco's control of their development company. A little pressure applied at the right time, and Wendell could be turned from ally to enemy. Arrange a meeting with Frederick, Gerald instructed. Use the Morrison Hotel's account as bait. He'll be interested in a contract that large. Gerald's security firm had recently signed a deal to provide comprehensive security services for Morrison Hotel's expansion into the region. It was a $20 million contract that would require significant subcontracting for construction and renovation work. Wendell Frederick would see it as a lifeline for his sinking partnership with Marco. That evening, Gerald returned home to find chaos. Emily was crying in the living room while Lynette paced frantically, her phone pressed to her ear. From the fragments of conversation he could hear, Lynette was trying to reach Marco, who had apparently stopped answering her calls. Don't understand what's happening, Lynette was saying. He's supposed to meet me tomorrow night, but his assistant says he's in meetings all week. She noticed Gerald standing in the doorway and quickly ended the call. Daddy, Emily sobbed, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Something terrible is happening. Wendell says Marco's company is in trouble. He says they might lose everything. Gerald felt a momentary pang of sympathy for his daughter. She was 18, legally an adult, but still naive about the adult world of consequences and betrayal. Unlike her mother, Emily's involvement in the affair had been passive. She'd been manipulated rather than being a willing participant. But that didn't absolve her of the cruelty she'd shown him, the casual dismissal, the way she'd treated him like furniture in his own home. These things happen in business, Gerald said neutrally. People make bad decisions and pay the price. Lynette's eyes flashed with anger. You're enjoying this, aren't you? You did something to Marco. I'm a security consultant, Not a wizard, Gerald replied. I can't make loan officers call in notes or environmental inspectors find code violations. If Marco's business is failing, it's because he built it on a foundation of poor decisions. The truth was that Gerald had done exactly those things, but his methods were untraceable. Every pressure point he'd activated had been through legitimate channels. Bank audits that revealed real irregularities he'd helped create, permit reviews that found violations he'd carefully orchestrated, and financial investigations that uncovered actual problems he'd manipulated into existence. You're lying, Lynette accused. You found out about us, and you're trying to destroy him. Gerald looked at his wife with genuine curiosity. And if I was, what exactly would you do about it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lynette had no answer because she had no power. For 15 years, she'd enjoyed the benefits of Gerald's success while contributing nothing to it. She'd lived in his house, spent his money, and enjoyed his protection without ever considering what would happen if she lost his goodwill. Now she was finding out. I want a divorce, Lynette declared, as if it were a threat rather than exactly what Gerald wanted. Of course you do, Gerald agreed. File the papers whenever you're ready. I'm sure your attorney will explain the implications of adultery in this state's divorce laws. Lynette's face went pale. She'd clearly been counting on Gerald's passive nature to ensure a favorable settlement. The realization that he might actually fight back had apparently never occurred to her. You can't prove anything, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Gerald pulled out his phone and played a brief audio clip. Lynette's voice filled the room, crystal clear as she spoke intimately to Marco about their plans to take half of Gerald's assets in the divorce. The recording had been made in their own bedroom 3 weeks earlier. I have hours of recordings, Gerald said matter-of-factly. Video surveillance, financial records, and testimony from several witnesses who can verify the timeline of your affair. Your attorney is welcome to review the evidence at his convenience. Emily had stopped crying and was staring at her parents with growing understanding. Mom, what did you do? Nothing that your father hasn't done, Lynette snapped. He's been emotionally absent for years. He's obsessed with his work. He never talks to us. He treats us like we're not even here. So you decided to steal money and sleep with another man, Gerald observed. That's certainly a proportional response to having a workaholic husband. The cruelty in Gerald's voice was subtle but unmistakable. He was dismantling Lynette's justifications as methodically as he was dismantling Marco's business empire. What happens now? Emily asked quietly. Gerald looked at his daughter with something that might have been regret. Now you both learn that actions have consequences. Your mother chose to betray our marriage vows. You chose to help her by spying on me for Marco's benefit. Those choices have costs. I didn't know. Emily started to protest. You knew enough. Gerald cut her off. You knew enough to take expensive gifts from a stranger. You knew enough to report my travel schedule and business meetings. You might not have understood the full scope of what you were doing, but you knew you were keeping secrets from me. Emily's face crumpled as the reality of her situation sank in. She'd been used by people she trusted, and now she was facing consequences she'd never anticipated. I'm sorry, Daddy, she whispered. Gerald studied his daughter's face, searching for signs of genuine remorse or mere regret at being caught. What he saw was a young woman who was finally beginning to understand that her actions mattered, that other people had feelings she could hurt. But understanding came too late. The damage was done, and Gerald Orozco was not a man who forgave betrayal, even from his own blood. Chapter 5. The Partner's Gambit. Wendell Frederick arrived at Gerald's office building the next morning dressed in his most expensive suit, clearly hoping to make a strong impression. At 35, Wendell was ambitious, ruthless in his own way, and increasingly desperate as he watched his partnership with Marco Houston crumble around him. Gerald had done his research. Wendell came from old money that had been squandered by his parents' poor decisions and extravagant lifestyle. The development partnership with Marco had been his chance to rebuild his family's fortune, but Marco's recent troubles threatened to drag them both down. Mr. Orozco, Wendell said, shaking Gerald's hand with the firm grip of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Please sit down. Gerald gestured to the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. I understand you're interested in the Morrison Hotel's contract. Very much so. It's exactly the kind of prestige project our company specializes in. Gerald opened a folder and spread out architectural plans for the hotel renovation project. 23 properties across the region, total construction value of $47 million. The security consultation alone is worth $6 million to my firm. Wendell's eyes widened as he studied the scope of the project. It was easily the largest contract his company had ever been offered. This would be a game changer for us. That's assuming your company survives long enough to complete it, Gerald observed casually. The comment hit Wendell like a slap. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean that Marco Houston is about to lose everything, and he's going to take you down with him unless you act quickly. Gerald leaned back in his chair, studying Wendell's reactions carefully. Tell me, what do you know about your partner's personal life? Marco keeps his private affairs private, Wendell said carefully. Admirable loyalty, but misplaced. Marco has been having an affair with my wife for 6 months. More importantly, he's been using that relationship to gather intelligence about my business operations and financial holdings. Wendell's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. Gerald slid a manila envelope across the table. These are copies of financial records showing money transfers from accounts belonging to my wife to offshore accounts controlled by Marco. There are also transcripts of recorded conversations where they discuss their plans to take half my assets in a divorce settlement. Wendell opened the envelope with trembling hands. As he read through the documents, his face grew progressively paler. This looks like, he began, industrial espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, theft by deception. Gerald's voice was calm, almost conversational. All federal crimes with substantial prison sentences. But I had nothing to do with this, Wendell protested. I never knew. Of course you didn't. You're a legitimate businessman who happened to be in partnership with someone who made very poor decisions. Gerald paused. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Wendell set down the documents and looked directly at Gerald. What do you want from me? I want justice. Marco Houston destroyed my family, so I'm going to destroy everything he's built. You can either go down with him, or you can choose to be part of the solution. And if I choose to be part of the solution? Gerald smiled. Then you take control of your development company before Marco's legal troubles contaminate it. You dissolve the partnership, assume control of the legitimate assets, and position yourself to handle contracts like Morrison Hotels. It was a lifeline, and they both knew it. Wendell could save his business and his reputation by cutting ties with Marco before the scandal broke. More importantly, he could emerge from the wreckage as the sole owner of a development company with a massive new contract. What would you need from me? Wendell asked. Complete cooperation. Financial records, business communications, anything that demonstrates Marco's misconduct. In exchange, you get the Morrison contract and my assurance that your name will be kept out of any criminal proceedings. Wendell was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he extended his hand. You have a deal. As they shook hands, Gerald felt a moment of satisfaction. He was turning Marco's allies against him, systematically isolating the man who had dared to target his family. But this was still just preparation for the real destruction to come. There is one more thing, Gerald said as Wendell prepared to leave. I'll need you to help me arrange a meeting with Marco. Somewhere private, where we can have an honest conversation about his future. Wendell nodded, though Gerald could see the man was beginning to understand that he'd just made a deal with someone far more dangerous than Marco Houston had ever been. That evening, Gerald returned home to find Emily waiting for him in his study. She'd been crying again, but there was something different about her demeanor, a maturity that hadn't been there before. Daddy, I need to tell you something, she said quietly. About Wendell. About what I told him. Gerald sat down behind his desk and waited. I gave him copies of your calendar, your travel schedule, your meeting notes, even some of your client files. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I don't know what I thought. Wendell said Marco was interested in doing business with you, that it would be good for everyone. It was worse than Gerald had suspected. His own daughter had been used to conduct industrial espionage against his company. The violation felt more personal than anything Lynette had done. "Did you take money for this information?" he asked. "No, just gifts. Expensive dinners, jewelry, a designer purse." Emily's hands were shaking. "I know how that sounds now, but at the time it felt like someone finally thought I was worth something." The admission revealed the deeper problem in their family. Emily had been desperate for attention and validation, vulnerable to manipulation because she felt ignored and undervalued at home. Gerald realized that his own emotional distance had created the opening that Marco and Wendell had exploited. But understanding the cause didn't absolve anyone of the consequences. "What you did was illegal," Gerald said quietly. "Corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets. If I wanted to press charges, you could face federal prosecution." Emily's face went white. "Daddy, please. I'm not going to press charges. You're my daughter, and despite everything, I love you." "But Emily, what you did has consequences that go beyond our family. My clients trusted me to protect their information, and you gave it to people who could have used it to harm them." "I'm sorry," Emily sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." "Sorry doesn't undo the damage," Gerald replied. "But it's a start." He stood and walked around the desk to where Emily sat crying. For a moment, he considered comforting her, perhaps finding a way to rebuild their relationship. But then he remembered the casual cruelty in her voice at dinner, the way she dismissed him as furniture, the months of deception and betrayal. Gerald Orozco had loved his family unconditionally for 18 years. Now he was learning to love himself more. "You'll be 18 until August," he said finally. "You can stay here until then, or you can leave now. After that, you'll need to find your own place." "You're kicking me out?" Emily's voice was filled with disbelief. "I'm in your childhood," Gerald corrected. "You made adult choices. Now you get to live with adult consequences." As he left Emily crying in his study, Gerald felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete clarity about his priorities. His family had betrayed him, used him, and discarded him. Now it was time for them to learn what life was like without his protection and support. The game was far from over, but Gerald was no longer playing defense. Chapter 6: The Trap Closes. Marco Houston stood in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district, feeling like a man walking to his own execution. Wendell had arranged this meeting, claiming it was their only chance to negotiate with Gerald Orozco before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The warehouse belonged to one of their former development projects, a property they'd purchased for renovation but never completed due to financing problems. It seemed fitting that Marco's empire might end in the same place where it had begun to falter. Gerald arrived exactly on time, accompanied by Angela Ingram and two other men Marco didn't recognize, but had the unmistakable bearing of former law enforcement. The message was clear. Gerald was prepared for any eventuality. "Thank you for coming," Gerald said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I thought we should have an honest conversation about your situation." Marco tried to project confidence he didn't feel. "I'm not sure what you think you've accomplished, but I have lawyers. Your lawyers are currently explaining to federal investigators why your offshore accounts receive payments from my wife's personal checking account," Gerald interrupted. "They're also trying to determine whether the industrial espionage charges will be filed in state or federal court." The mention of espionage made Marco's blood run cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." Gerald nodded to Angela, who opened a briefcase and removed a stack of documents. "These are copies of my company's client files. Confidential security assessments, travel schedules for protected individuals, even architectural plans for facilities we're securing. All of this information was found on your personal computer." Marco's mind raced. He'd never seen those documents before in his life. "That's impossible. I never." "Emily Orozco provided you with this information over a period of 6 months, Gerald continued. "My daughter, whom you manipulated through your business partner, gave you access to classified information that could have been used to harm my clients." The trap was beginning to close around Marco, and he finally understood the scope of Gerald's plan. This wasn't just about the affair or the money. Gerald was constructing a federal case for espionage and conspiracy. You planted that evidence, Marco accused. Did I? Or did you simply underestimate how thoroughly I document everything in my business? Gerald's smile was razor sharp. The beauty of the situation is that it doesn't matter. The evidence exists, it's on your computer, and federal prosecutors tend to take industrial espionage very seriously. Wendell stepped forward, his face pale, but determined. Marco, there's something else you need to know. I've dissolved our partnership and transferred all company assets to a new entity. You're no longer an owner or officer of Fredder Development Group. The betrayal hit Marco like a physical blow. His own partner had sold him out to save himself. You bastard. We built this company together. We built it, and you destroyed it, Wendell replied. I'm not going to prison because you couldn't keep your pants on. Gerald watched the exchange with satisfaction. Turning allies against each other was a classic strategy, and Marco's isolation was now complete. No business partners, no financial resources, and soon, no freedom. What do you want? Marco asked, finally accepting the reality of his situation. I want you to understand what you've done, Gerald replied. You didn't just have an affair with my wife. You systematically attacked my family, my business, and my reputation. You used my own daughter against me. You stole my money and my confidential information. You turned my home into a battlefield. Gerald began walking slowly around Marco, like a predator circling wounded prey. Do you know what I do for a living, Marco? I protect people from threats. I identify vulnerabilities and eliminate them before they can cause damage. That's exactly what I'm doing now. The FBI will see through this, Marco said desperately. They'll know you set me up. Will they? Let's see. A real estate developer with a history of aggressive business practices gains access to classified security information through an affair with the wife of a security consultant. He uses that information to target the consultant's clients and potentially compromise their safety. When discovered, he attempts to claim he was framed by the very man he was trying to destroy. Gerald paused his circling to look directly at Marco. Which version sounds more believable to you? The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Marco's labored breathing. He was trapped in a narrative of Gerald's creation, and every attempt to escape would only make him look more guilty. There is one alternative, Gerald said finally. What? You disappear. Tonight. Leave the country. Never contact my wife or daughter again, and never return. In exchange, I'll make sure the federal investigation loses momentum. It was an offer of exile rather than prison, but Marco could see the trap within the trap. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, the FBI receives a complete dossier on your activities, including evidence of additional crimes I haven't mentioned yet. Industrial espionage, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud. You'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Marco looked at Wendell, hoping for some sign of support or alternative, but his former partner was staring at the floor. The man who had once been his closest ally was now actively helping to destroy him. How do I know you'll keep your word? Marco asked. You don't, Gerald replied simply. But you know with absolute certainty what happens if you stay. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Marco could flee the country and hope Gerald honored their agreement, or he could stay and face certain prosecution. Neither option offered him any real future, but one at least offered him freedom. I'll need time to arrange. You have 6 hours, Gerald cut him off. There's a private jet waiting at the municipal airport. It will take you to a non-extradition country where you can start over with whatever assets you've managed to hide offshore. As Marco stumbled toward the warehouse exit, broken and defeated, Gerald felt a moment of genuine satisfaction. The man who had dared to attack his family was being systematically erased from existence. His business destroyed, his reputation ruined, his freedom forfeit. But the game wasn't over yet. Marco had been the weapon, but Lynette had been the one who chose to use it. And Emily had been the one who loaded it with ammunition. It still had prices to pay. Chapter 7. The Exile's Price. 6 hours later, Marco Houston sat in the cabin of a private jet flying toward a destination he couldn't even pronounce. Gerald had been true to his word. The plane was waiting, fueled, and ready, with a pilot who asked no questions and requested no identification beyond a passport that had been waiting for Marco in an envelope on his seat. But as the lights of his former life disappeared below the clouds, Marco began to understand the true genius of Gerald's revenge. He wasn't just being exiled, he was being erased. His business was gone, his assets frozen or transferred, his reputation destroyed. Even if he somehow managed to return to the United States, there would be nothing left for him. Meanwhile, Gerald stood in his study, watching news reports of Marco's mysterious disappearance on his computer screens. The story was already spreading through the real estate community. Successful developer vanishes overnight, leaving behind a company in ruins and a trail of suspicious financial transactions. Angela Ingram knocked on his door. The FBI called off their investigation, she reported. With the primary suspect fled, they're treating it as a closed case. They did ask if we wanted to pursue civil damages. No need, Gerald replied. Justice has been served. But even as he said it, Gerald knew the statement wasn't quite true. Marco had been neutralized, but the betrayal of his family remained unresolved. Exile was too easy an escape for the people who had lived in his house, taken his money, and stabbed him in the back while he slept beside them. Lynette chose that moment to burst into his study without knocking, her face flushed with rage and desperation. What did you do to Marco? He's gone, vanished, and his company says he's no longer employed there. I imagine he decided to explore new opportunities, Gerald said mildly. The real estate market can be quite volatile. Don't play games with me. Lynette's voice cracked with hysteria. I know you did something to him. You destroyed his business, you ruined his life, and now he's gone. Gerald looked at his wife with something approaching pity. You're absolutely right. I destroyed Marco Houston as thoroughly as I knew how. I dismantled his business, seized his assets, turned his allies against him, and finally gave him a choice between exile and imprisonment. The casual confession stunned Lynette into silence. She'd expected denials, not matter-of-fact admissions. The question, Gerald continued, is what you're going to do about it. Lynette's anger flared again. I'm going to tell everyone what you did. I'm going to expose you as the monster you really are. Please do, Gerald encouraged. Tell people that your husband discovered your affair and responded by legally destroying your lover's business empire. Tell them that the man you betrayed fought back instead of rolling over. Tell them that Gerald Orozco isn't the weak, passive victim you thought he was. For the first time, Lynette seemed to understand that she'd been living with a stranger for 15 years. The man she'd married had been quiet and focused on his work, but she'd mistaken introversion for weakness, professional dedication for emotional absence. You're not the man I married, she whispered. You're absolutely right, Gerald agreed. The man you married believed in loyalty, trust, and family bonds. He thought that love was unconditional and that marriage vows meant something. That man died the night you called me a nobody at our dinner table. Gerald stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn he'd worked years to afford. The man you're talking to now is someone else entirely. Someone who understands that love without respect is worthless, that loyalty without reciprocity is slavery, and that family bonds can be broken by the people who should cherish them most. I want a divorce, Lynette declared, as if it were a threat rather than exactly what Gerald wanted. The papers will be ready tomorrow, Gerald replied. Given the evidence of adultery, theft, and conspiracy, I expect you'll find the settlement terms quite unfavorable. Lynette's face went white as the reality of her situation finally penetrated. She'd been counting on Gerald's passivity to ensure a comfortable divorce settlement. Now she was facing the prospect of leaving with nothing more than what she could prove she'd brought to the marriage. You can't do this, she protested. I have rights. You had rights, Gerald corrected. You forfeited them when you chose to betray our marriage, steal our money, and conspire with a stranger to destroy our family. Actions have consequences, Lynette. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way. As Lynette fled from his study, Gerald felt a moment of something that might have been regret. They'd built a life together once, shared dreams and plans, created a daughter they both loved. But betrayal had poisoned all of that, turning love into contempt and partnership into warfare. The man, Gerald, might have found a way to forgive, to rebuild, to salvage something from the wreckage of their marriage. But that man was gone, replaced by someone harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. There was still one more betrayal to address. Chapter 8. A Daughter's Reckoning. Emily found her father in his study later that evening, sitting in the dark and staring out at the city lights. She'd been avoiding him for days, unsure how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But with Marco gone and her mother in full panic mode, Emily was beginning to understand that her world was collapsing around her. "Daddy," she said quietly from the doorway. "Can we talk?" Gerald turned on his desk lamp, but remained seated. His face was unreadable in the soft light. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Emily stepped into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd confessed to giving away his business secrets. "I've been thinking about what you said, about consequences and betrayal and family. And what have you concluded? I think I understand now why you're so angry. What Mom did was terrible, but what I did..." Emily's voice broke slightly. "I helped them hurt you. I gave them information they used against you. I'm as guilty as they are." Gerald studied his daughter's face, searching for signs of genuine understanding versus mere regret at being caught. What he saw was a young woman who was finally beginning to grasp the adult concept of moral responsibility. "Do you know what I do for a living, Emily?" Gerald asked. "You protect people. You keep them safe." "That's right. And do you know what the most dangerous threat to any security system is?" Emily shook her head. "Insider betrayal," Gerald explained. "When someone who's trusted with access uses that trust to help enemies attack from within. It's the one thing that no amount of planning or preparation can fully protect against." The parallel was clear, and Emily's face crumpled as she understood. "I was the insider threat to our family." "You were manipulated," Gerald acknowledged. "But you were also willing to be manipulated because it got you something you wanted: attention, expensive gifts, the feeling of being special." Emily was crying now, but they were different tears than before. Not the tears of a child being punished, but the tears of someone finally understanding the true weight of their actions. "Is there any way to fix this?" she asked. "Any way to make it right?" Gerald was quiet for a long moment. This was the question he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Emily was his daughter, his blood, the child he'd raised and loved. But she was also the person who had betrayed his trust as deeply as any stranger could have. "I don't know," he said finally. "Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And the truth is, Emily, I'm not sure I want to try." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. "You don't want to try?" "For 18 years, I worked every day to provide for this family. I built a business, bought this house, paid for your education, your clothes, your activities. I thought I was building something permanent, a legacy for you to inherit, a foundation for your future." Gerald's voice remained calm, but Emily could hear the pain underneath. "And all of that time, you and your mother saw me as an obstacle to overcome, a resource to exploit, a problem to manage. You didn't see me as a person with feelings who could be hurt." "That's not true, isn't it?" Gerald challenged. "When was the last time you asked about my day, my work, my thoughts about anything? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life beyond what it could provide for yours?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She couldn't remember a single time in recent years when she treated her father as anything more than a source of money and transportation. "I was a child," she said weakly. "You were a child when you were 8, and you threw tantrums when you didn't get your way. You're 18 now. You're old enough to vote, to serve in the military, to get married. You're old enough to understand that other people have feelings and that your actions affect them." Gerald stood and walked around his desk to where Emily sat. For a moment, she thought he might comfort her, might find some path toward reconciliation. Instead, he handed her a manila envelope. "What is this?" she asked. "Your mother and I are divorcing. These are the papers explaining your options." Emily opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were legal documents outlining custody arrangements, child support calculations, and visitation schedules. "I don't understand," she said, scanning the complex legal language. "You're 18. So legal custody is an issue. But you're still in high school, so there are questions about support and where you'll live. Gerald's voice was businesslike now, devoid of emotional inflection. Your mother will receive minimal spousal support given her adultery and theft. She'll need to find a job and a place to live. Emily's face went pale as she understood the implications. You're cutting us off. I'm into my financial responsibility for people who have shown me nothing but contempt and betrayal. Your mother can support herself, and you can learn to do the same. But what about college? What about my future? What about it? You're an adult now. Your future is your responsibility. The cruelty in Gerald's words was devastating because it was delivered so matter-of-factly. He wasn't shouting or expressing anger. He was simply explaining the new reality with the same calm professionalism he might use to explain security protocols to a client. "Daddy, please," Emily begged. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm your daughter. I'm your family." Gerald looked at her for a long moment, and Emily thought she saw a flicker of the father she remembered from her childhood. But when he spoke, his voice was still cold. Family is built on love, trust, and mutual respect. When those things are gone, what's left is just people who happen to share DNA. He walked back to his desk and sat down. You and your mother made your choices. Now you get to live with them. Emily sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that her father, the man she'd dismissed as weak and irrelevant, was the strongest person she'd ever known. Strong enough to walk away from the people he loved when they proved unworthy of that love. "Is there anything I can do?" she whispered. "Any way to prove that I've learned from this?" Gerald considered the question seriously. "Yes, you can learn to take care of yourself. You can build a life based on your own merit rather than what other people provide for you. You can understand that love is something you earn through your actions, not something you're entitled to because of your birth. And if I do those things, then maybe someday we can have a conversation about rebuilding something between us. But Emily, it would have to be something entirely new. The relationship we had before is dead, killed by the choices you and your mother made." As Emily left his study, Gerald felt the final piece of his old life falling away. He'd lost his wife to betrayal, exiled his enemy to permanent exile, and now severed ties with the daughter who had helped destroy his trust. It should have felt like defeat, but instead, Gerald felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom. Chapter 9. The New Foundation. 6 months later, Gerald stood in the same study where his old life had been dismantled, but everything was different now. The divorce had been finalized with extreme prejudice. Lynette received minimal spousal support for 2 years and none of the assets she'd counted on taking. Emily had moved in with her mother to a small apartment across town, both of them working service jobs to make ends meet. Gerald's security consulting business had flourished in the aftermath of the Marco Houston affair. Word had spread through the corporate community about his decisive handling of a threat to his operation, and clients appreciated working with someone who could protect their interests with such ruthless efficiency. Angela Ingram knocked on his door. "The Henderson Industries contract came through," she announced. "They want us to handle security for their entire Pacific Northwest expansion." It was a $40 million deal, the largest in the company's history. Gerald nodded with satisfaction. Success, it turned out, was the best revenge of all. "Any word from our former friends?" Marco Houston was spotted in Montenegro last month, apparently working as a tour guide for American tourists. "Lynette tried to contact you through the office twice this week, but I told her you weren't available." Gerald wasn't surprised by either development. Marco was probably running low on the money he'd managed to hide offshore, reduced to menial work in a country where his business acumen meant nothing. Lynette was likely discovering that the skills required to be a wealthy man's wife didn't translate to success in the working world. "What about Emily?" Angela's expression softened slightly. "She's enrolled in community college, working part-time at a bookstore to pay tuition. Her grades are apparently excellent." This information interested Gerald more than he cared to admit. Emily was learning the lessons he'd tried to teach her: the value of hard work, the importance of self-reliance, the cost of betrayal. Whether those lessons would lead to genuine change remained to be seen. His intercom buzzed. Mr. Orozco? There's someone here to see you. She says she's your daughter. Gerald felt a moment of surprise. Emily had tried to contact him several times over the past 6 months, but he'd refused all communication. The fact that she'd come to his office suggested either desperation or determination. Send her in. Emily entered the room looking like a different person than the teenager who'd lived in his house. She was thinner, her clothes were inexpensive but clean, and she carried herself with a maturity that hadn't been there before. Most importantly, her eyes held something Gerald hadn't seen in years: genuine respect. "Hello, Daddy," she said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me." Gerald gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to tell you about school and work and what I've learned over the past few months." For the next hour, Emily talked about her life, the challenge of working while attending college, the humiliation of living in a cramped apartment after years in a mansion, the difficulty of making friends when you could no longer afford the lifestyle of your peer group. But she also talked about accomplishments Gerald hadn't expected. Dean's List grades despite working 30 hours a week, a promotion at the bookstore to assistant manager, a growing understanding of literature and philosophy that had come from actually reading books rather than just owning them. "I understand now what you were trying to teach me," Emily said finally, "about consequences and responsibility and earning what you have instead of just expecting it." Gerald listened without interruption, studying his daughter's face for signs of manipulation or false sentiment. What he saw was genuine growth, the transformation of a spoiled teenager into a young woman who was learning to navigate the world on her own merit. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "Nothing," Emily replied, and the answer surprised him. "I'm not here to ask for money or help or forgiveness. I'm here because I wanted you to know that the lessons you taught me weren't wasted." It was the first time in her life that Emily had come to him without wanting something, and Gerald found himself genuinely moved by the gesture. "And your mother?" he asked. Emily's expression hardened slightly. "Mom is still angry. She blames you for everything that happened, says you overreacted to what she calls a minor indiscretion. She thinks I should hate you for cutting us off. But you don't. No, I think you did exactly what you should have done. We betrayed you, stole from you, and treated you like garbage in your own home. The fact that you didn't destroy us completely shows more mercy than we deserved." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. The daughter sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the girl who'd called him furniture at their dinner table. This Emily understood accountability, respected strength, and had learned to value what she'd earned rather than what she'd been given. "Are you asking for a relationship?" he said finally. "I'm asking for the chance to build one. Not based on what we used to have, but on who we are now." Emily met his eyes directly. "I know I don't deserve it. I know you don't owe me anything. But if you're willing to try, I'd like to prove that I'm worthy of being your daughter." It was exactly the right answer, acknowledging fault without making excuses, asking for opportunity without demanding entitlement. Gerald realized that his punishment had accomplished something he'd never expected. It had forged his spoiled child into someone who might actually be worth respecting. "We'll start slowly," he said finally. "Dinner once a month. You pay your own way, we talk about your life and goals, and we see if there's something real to build on." Emily's face lit up with genuine joy. "Thank you, Daddy. I won't disappoint you again." "No," Gerald agreed, "you won't. Because now you understand the cost of disappointment." As Emily left his office, Gerald reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He'd lost a wife who'd never truly valued him, exiled an enemy who'd dared to attack his family, and severed ties with a daughter who'd betrayed his trust. But from the wreckage of those relationships, something new might be emerging, a connection based on mutual respect rather than obligation, on earned trust rather than assumed loyalty. Gerald Orozco had learned that love without respect was worthless, that loyalty without reciprocity was slavery, and that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest. But he'd also learned that strength could triumph over betrayal, that justice could prevail over manipulation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people the true cost of their choices. The man who'd been dismissed as a nobody had proven himself to be someone who mattered very much indeed. And in the end, That was the only victory that truly counted. As Gerald looked out at the city lights from his office window, he raised his glass in a silent toast. Not to revenge, which was a temporary satisfaction, but to the much more lasting achievement of self-respect. He'd built a new life on the ashes of the old one. And this time, he'd built it for himself. The glass clinked once against the window,